I want to do what God's calling me to do more than I want to have whatever somebody would call a normal life. You know, my life is normal for me, but it's not normal according to your everyday society.
So there are sacrifices then,
Yeah,
as
there
you're
are,
saying, for
certainly.
ministry.
There are, but you know, anything that we give up for God, He gives it back to us multiplied so many, many times over. I mean,
Millions revere Joyce Meyer as a healer. Millions more dismiss her as the biggest fraud in the evangelical world. She has been at the center of Senate investigations, multi-million-dollar financial scandals, and even a shocking murder case involving her own right-hand man. How did a woman who survived the most brutal of adversities rise to command a highly controversial billion-dollar empire? Is faith truly her ultimate goal, or merely a tool in a deeply ambitious transactional game? Today, we are pulling back the curtain on the whole truth. The Dark House in Missouri. Joyce Meyer was born in 1943 in St. Louis, Missouri. The outside world of post-war America seemed stable, but behind the manicured lawns lay families breaking apart in silence. The Hutchison family was a prime example. Joyce's father, a World War II veteran returning with psychological trauma that didn't even have a name back then, turned their home into a military barracks. His rules were absolute. In that suffocatingly controlling environment, Joyce faced a horrifying reality. She was sexually abused by her own biological father throughout her childhood. There was nowhere to run, and no one to cry out to for help. And the tragedy didn't stop there. Joyce's mother knew, or at the very least, she suspected, but she chose to remain silent. Not because she was cruel, but because she was terrified. Terrified of her husband, terrified of the neighbors' gossip, terrified of the church's judgment. The 1950s. American culture treated divorce as a strict taboo. Women were taught to endure, to keep the family together, and to stay quiet even as they shattered on the inside. Years later, Joyce spoke about her mother in a way that left many stunned. She was furious with her for years. It wasn't until adulthood that she realized her mother was a victim too, just in a different way. The trauma from her family forced Joyce to learn early on how to wear a mask, always smiling and excelling at school to cover up the tragedy behind closed doors. The prolonged abuse planted a twisted belief in her mind that she was entirely unworthy of love. This belief wouldn't just haunt her future relationships, it would fundamentally shape how she interpreted faith and God. At 18, Joyce left home hoping to find freedom, completely unaware that her upcoming marriage would just be the beginning of another string of devastating mistakes. The marriage that almost destroyed Joyce. Joyce got married for the first time when she was still very young. She was not being selective. She simply wanted to leave her parents' house as quickly as possible. The man was a part-time car salesman, handsome, smooth-talking, and knew how to make an 18-year-old girl who had just escaped hell feel loved. But that image quickly collapsed. He turned out to be a liar, a manipulator, and an irresponsible man, almost like a younger version of the father Joyce had tried to run from. The marriage began falling apart almost immediately. He would disappear for days without explanation, leaving Joyce alone to worry about food, milk, and daily survival. When Joyce became pregnant with her first son, David, the pain became even more brutal. Her husband was not only absent, he was living with another woman. Joyce had to work until the final month of her pregnancy because her husband had taken all her money. Later, he even forced her to steal payroll checks from her workplace. Joyce did not do it out of greed. She did it out of fear. Fear of her husband. Fear that she could not feed her child. And fear of being abandoned all over again. Years later, after her life had changed, she publicly admitted what she had done and paid back every cent. The marriage lasted 5 years, ending when her husband got into trouble with the law and was sent to prison. At 28, Joyce was alone with a child, without a stable career, without trust in men, and at the lowest point of her life. But just when she believed everything was over, fate was about to bring another man into her life. This time, everything would be different. The turning point that changed everything. In 1966, Joyce met Dave Meyer, an Army veteran working as an engineering draftsman. He was not flashy or smooth-talking like her first husband, but he had something Joyce had never found in a man before: deep calm. Joyce brought all her pain into the new marriage. She was angry, controlling, and emotionally explosive. But Dave did not answer chaos with chaos. When she screamed, he stayed patient. When she pushed him away, he did not leave. Years later, Joyce admitted she had not been an easy wife, and that Dave had endured far more than she deserved. That patience became her anchor. For the first time, Joyce had a home without fear, a dinner table without tension, and a man who did not disappear. In February 1976, at 33, Joyce reached a breaking point and cried out to God. She later described that moment as a total transformation, the beginning of everything. Afterward, she began preaching in small Bible studies and morning meetings at work. Her message was different. She spoke openly about trauma, anxiety, insecurity, and pain. She did not pretend faith erased suffering overnight. She told people she was fighting the same battles they were. People listened. Then they told others. By 1980, Joyce became an associate pastor at Life Christian Center in Missouri. She recorded radio programs from a garage studio with only a microphone and a message. In the 1990s, her ministry exploded. Enjoying Everyday Life reached more than 100 countries. Her books sold millions. Her conferences filled arenas, and her ministry expanded into charity, disaster relief, and global outreach. To millions of women, Joyce became more than a televangelist. She proved that a wounded woman could still have a voice, stand behind a pulpit, and help heal others. But with fame came scrutiny. And as more people listened, more began asking one question: what exactly was Joyce Meyer preaching? The first wave of criticism. By the early 2000s, Joyce Meyer was making headlines for a very different reason. The inspiring stories about her rise from trauma were replaced by growing scrutiny over what she was actually preaching. One major controversy centered on the prosperity gospel, the belief that strong faith, positive thinking, and obedience to God would lead to wealth and success. Joyce did not create the movement, but many of her sermons strongly reflected its ideas. Supporters felt encouraged by her message, believing their lives could improve. Critics, however, argued it turned faith into a transaction, as if God rewarded people financially for believing hard enough. The backlash became even stronger when some of Joyce's sermons suggested that sickness, tragedy, or suffering could be connected to weak faith or negative thinking. To many grieving families, especially parents who had lost children, those words felt devastating. They had prayed and believed, yet tragedy still happened. Critics argued her message placed guilt on people already carrying unbearable pain. At the same time, theologians challenged several teachings linked to the Word of Faith movement, including controversial claims about what happened to Jesus after the crucifixion. Many believed her teachings drifted far from traditional Christian doctrine. Then, in 2019, Joyce publicly admitted that some of her earlier teachings were wrong and out of balance, especially the idea that people lacked faith because they were sick or suffering. Supporters praised her honesty and humility. Critics asked why it took more than 30 years to acknowledge the damage those teachings may have caused. But the theological debates were only part of the controversy. When American journalists began investigating the finances of Joyce Meyer Ministries, they uncovered revelations that shocked the nation. An empire of gold and private jets. In 2003, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch published an explosive, multi-part investigative series exposing the staggering wealth of Joyce Meyer and her family. The numbers were so jarring that even her most loyal followers had to read them twice. Joyce and her family lived in an exclusive, gated compound near St. Louis, heavily guarded by security gates and surveillance cameras. Her personal residence was valued at over $2 million. Additional properties owned by family members added millions more to the tally. Some of these assets were held under the ministry's name. Others were personally owned. To put it in perspective, a decorative table in Joyce's living room cost more than the annual salary of an average nurse in Missouri. Inside the headquarters of Joyce Meyer Ministries, reporters noted high-end furnishings and priceless art lining the hallways. One decorative round table was purchased for $30,000. An antique commode topped $23,000. These weren't wild rumors. They were hard numbers pulled directly from financial records and investigative reports of the time. Joyce's wardrobe and accessories also became a massive talking point. Viewers started noticing the custom-tailored suits, luxury watches, and designer shoes making regular appearances on screen every week. Critics meticulously calculated the cost of each item, noting the glaring hypocrisy of preaching simplicity while dripping in high-end couture. But the detail that truly shocked America was the private jet. Joyce Meyer Ministries owned a Gulfstream, a corporate jet typically reserved for the ultra-wealthy. The press estimated its value at around $10 million. Joyce defended the purchase, claiming the jet was an absolute necessity for her grueling international travel schedule and global missionary work. It was a logical argument, perhaps, but the optics were impossible to reconcile. One simple question echoed across newspapers and cable news networks. Jesus walked everywhere. Why does his messenger need a Gulfstream? Press scrutiny inevitably led to government scrutiny. In 2007, Senator Charles Grassley of Iowa launched an official congressional investigation. The targets? 6 of the highest-profile televangelists in America: Joyce Meyer, Kenneth Copeland, Creflo Dollar, Eddie Long, Benny Hinn, Paula White. These were the heavyweights, the ones with the biggest budgets, the largest followings, and the highest suspicion of abusing the tax-exempt status granted to religious organizations. Out of the 6, only Joyce Meyer and Benny Hinn fully cooperated with the probe. The other 4 outright refused to hand over documents, hiding behind the shield of religious freedom. Did Joyce cooperate because she had nothing to hide? Or because she was simply better at hiding it than the rest? The answer depends entirely on who you ask. Under mounting public pressure, Joyce announced a reduction in her personal salary from the ministry. She stated she would live primarily off the royalties from her books. It sounded incredibly humble until you remember that her books sell millions of copies worldwide every single year. Those royalties still generated a colossal income. Skeptics looked at the move and saw a clever restructuring of cash flow, not genuine reform. But the money, the mansions, and the private jets weren't the darkest parts of this story. Because in 2009, a murder took place, and the man standing right in the center of it was Joyce Meyer's right-hand man. The shocking murder. Christopher Coleman was the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries. For years, he didn't just sit behind a desk. He traveled with Joyce on business trips. He was the personal bodyguard standing inches away from her at massive, globally televised events. On paper, and in the eyes of his colleagues, Coleman was the quintessential Christian family man. Married to his wife, Sherry. 2 young sons. A regular churchgoer. Beneath the surface, it was a completely different story. Coleman had been hiding a secret affair for years with a woman from another state. The relationship was so serious that he wanted out of his marriage. But getting a divorce while working as a highly visible figure for a massive Christian ministry meant losing his job, his reputation, and his entire life's work. So, Coleman chose a different path. In the months leading up to the murder, threatening messages began arriving at the Coleman home. Chilling emails, death threats, vicious language. They were reported to the police, serving as evidence that a deranged stalker was targeting his family. Later, investigators uncovered a bone-chilling truth. Coleman himself was sending the messages. He was staging a phantom enemy so that when the murder happened, all suspicion would fall on a fictional suspect. On the night of May 5, 2009, Sherry Coleman and her 2 young sons were brutally murdered in their own home. Coleman initially played the part of the distraught husband, screaming for help and calling the police. But the evidence quickly turned against him. The staged messages, the concealed affair, the conflicting statements. Coleman was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 3 life terms without the possibility of parole. The case left behind a glaring question that Joyce Meyer Ministries has never adequately answered. In a massive religious organization with layers upon layers of oversight, how could a future family annihilator hide everything right under their noses? Some sources suggest Sherry Coleman had suspected the affair earlier and might have even confided in someone. Others heavily scrutinized the ministry's background checks and behavioral evaluations for high-ranking staff. How many red flags were ignored before a mother and 2 boys lost their lives? Sherry Coleman's family didn't let that question go. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Joyce Meyer Ministries, arguing that the organization failed to recognize or willfully ignored the warning signs in their senior employees' behavior. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed by the court, citing insufficient legal grounds to hold the ministry civilly liable for Coleman's personal criminal actions. The law sided with the ministry, but the PR damage was something no court ruling could ever reverse. If you thought that was the final scandal for Joyce Meyer Ministries, you'd be wrong. Because just months ago, in 2025, a brand new bombshell dropped. The latest questions. In 2025, Joyce Meyer Ministries officially severed its broadcasting ties with the Daystar television network, one of the largest Christian networks in America. It was a partnership that had spanned years. Daystar was a crucial platform that beamed Joyce's programs into millions of living rooms. The split followed a barrage of allegations aimed at Daystar's leadership regarding ethical issues, internal misconduct, and dark open secrets. Prior to this, Marcus Lamb, Daystar's co-founder, had been embroiled in his own internal scandals regarding his private life and organizational ethics. Marcus passed away in 2021, but the rot inside Daystar didn't die with him. The question many are asking is, why did Joyce wait until 2025 to cut the cord? If these issues had been festering for years, is silence really an innocent choice? That same year, a quieter issue began to surface. Joyce has 4 children, but not all of them have remained close to her in recent years. Some of her children and grandchildren reportedly walked away from their roles in the ministry following internal disputes. The details have never been officially released, but observers quickly noticed the glaring absence of certain faces at major family events. A woman who preaches about family love to millions around the globe. In her own home, whose chairs are sitting empty at Thanksgiving? And then there's one more question rarely asked, but always lingering. Dave Meyer. For decades, Dave has almost never preached on the main stage. He appears next to Joyce on television, always quiet, smiling, nodding. But inside the ministry, Dave's role is described as colossal. Several sources claim that Dave is the one who has masterminded the majority of the financial and strategic decisions for Joyce Meyer Ministries over the years. Is Dave the most devoted husband in America? Or is he the shadow CEO of a multi-hundred-million-dollar empire? Perhaps he is both at the exact same time. 2 portraits, 1 person. There are 2 ways to tell the story of Joyce Meyer. Both are true, and that is exactly what makes it so uncomfortable. The first tells the story of a survivor, an abused little girl who rose from a childhood most people would never recover from. A single mother who raised a child through years of crushing poverty and betrayal. A woman born in the 1940s who shattered gender barriers in the church, stepping up to the pulpit at a time when most American congregations weren't ready to hear a woman speak. She touched millions of hearts with a simple, profound message. You are not alone. You can heal. The second tells the story of a profiteer, a televangelist living in a $2 million mansion while many of her followers drown in medical bills and credit card debt. A woman flying in a $10 million private jet while preaching about humility. An organizational leader who stayed silent amid scandals brewing inside her own walls. A teacher who took over 30 years to admit that some of what she taught was deeply flawed. Both portraits are painted with facts. Both belong to the exact same person. And there is one more angle rarely discussed. Kenneth Copeland, a male televangelist of the same generation, is estimated to have a net worth many times that of Joyce. He owns more private jets, lives in a bigger mansion. Yet it is Joyce, not Copeland, who has consistently been the primary target of intense investigative criticism in major newspapers. Is society harsher on a successful woman in the evangelical world? Joyce has to carry two accusations at once: being a fraud and being a woman who lacked the humility to stay in her place. The question the Joyce Meyer story truly asks isn't just about one person. It's about all of us. Is it possible to be both a victim and a profiteer? Both a healer and a hurter? Can a message save millions of people while making millions of others feel utterly betrayed? The story of Joyce Meyer forces us to ask questions that perhaps no one dares to answer honestly. About ourselves, about faith, and about the true cost of power.